Hello, back with another lecture. We're starting off this week with two lectures that are so closely connected. The Rise of Islam will be this lecture. I'm calling this The Rise of Islam from Late Antiquity to Islam. And the second lecture is just going to be on the life of the prophets. And I'll explain why I'm separating these lectures out below. So in the last lecture, I talked about civilization in late antiquity, and I said that one of the primary features that we want to emphasize is that one is the one God, one emperor, one state thesis. Another aspect of this of late antiquity religion is salvation in one lifetime, and third, that there are or there were religious specialists who worked on a scripture that were in employ by the state and led by the king or emperor. And you can see even by the slide here, caliph. These are all three aspects of these traditions in both the Christendom and the Sasanian Empire would continue in Islam. So this is one aspect of these are aspects of the continuity. So in terms of, so this is from late antiquity to Islam. What's changed, or how can we think about the nature of the change? And this is particularly problematic in giving a history of a tradition that, like any tradition, resists the idea of it changing. So it's quite common of a religious person in any tradition to say that things don't change, that we're still doing the religion the same way that Moses set it down in the Torah for Jews, or that Christ taught it for Christians, or for Muslims the way that Muhammad instructed, the way that Muhammad guided us. So the nature of the communities themselves is that they resist admitting change. So in this, our project is different from the religious perspective. We are actually interested in how Islam did change over time as historians of religion, historians of Islam. So one way to think about this, to think about how Islam changes, but also how it explains these changes and rationalizes the change to cover its tracks, as it were, and to say that there is no significant changes, is to think of it in terms of a palimpsest. A palimpsest. A palimpsest is a technical term for a animal skin, which was used as a writing surface. So before there was paper, this was one important writing tool in the pre-modern period. Before the 8th century, let's just say, in Islam, and continues to be used, incidentally, in certain traditions, including Judaism. This is what Torahs are written on. But in any case, these animal hides, they were very expensive, of course, especially if you've got a big swath of a large surface. And so what they would do is, rather than if a document became worn out, you would scrape it off and write over it again. And traditions like Islam, like Judaism, like Christianity, one can think of as palimpsest traditions. So you don't wipe things out; you kind of rewrite over the same material, but you can still see the older material in back if you kind of look carefully. So in a sense, that's what we're going to be doing partly as we think about Islamic history, Islamic tradition, is thinking about what Muslims not only say today, but how views have changed over time. And I think Hodgson does a nice job of discussing this idea of, every generation makes its own rules, or has its own attitudes. It's important not to reify traditions and say Islam is essentially X, or Americans are essentially Y. This is in a certain sense, both for Americans and for Muslims, it's up to the current generation to define what we maintain and what we drop. And this is an ongoing process of cultural change, particularly in traditional societies that link themselves to the past. So in this slide, I just wanted to orient you with the region we're going to be talking about. So if you look at the Red Sea, which is bordered by Saudi Arabia to its east, and Egypt, Sudan to its west, and look at the Persian Gulf, or the Arabian Gulf, as it's called by its different constituent countries that surround it, just to orient you, the Mediterranean to the north, So these are the modern countries, and now I'm going to take you to the to our empire. So try to remember before I flip it, is for where's the Byzantine Empire, where's the Sasanian Empire. So take a minute and look at these. Look at where Iraq is. Look what Saudi Arabia is, just to orient you. Jordan, Palestine, Israel, Lebanon. So you can see here's the Byzantine Empire. So we're partly, it covers, and the Sasanian Empire. As you can see, it's Sasanian. It's partly Iraq and Iran, and points east. In the west, we have Egypt, Syria, going into and what's today modern Turkey, parts of Iraq also. So look at where Mecca and Yathrib, so that's Mecca and Medina, are. And this again, if you see these, one of the important roles that the Arabs had, as we're going to talk about, is traders. So they're mediating, they're helping goods get across the desert from the capital of the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople, to the Sasanian Empire, up, and also, we don't have it on our map here, but in the south to Abyssinia, to Ethiopia. So the Arabs, traders, have domesticated the camel, are using it as a implement of transporting goods. They also have the wheel, and they're using these to as merchants. And what really gives them the huge advantage over the peoples in these empires is that the Arabs know where the watering holes are. So this gives the tribes a kind of special advantage, and it's really difficult for the Sasanian Empire, for the Byzantine Empire, to follow. If they wanted to, for example, attack these regions, they have these heavy armor, but they don't have water, and so it's a major. It wasn't worth their time to take Arabia, so it was kind of a no man's land, or a nomad land that was ruled by the Arab tribes in late antiquity. So here you have a map of the early Islamic conquests, and we're skipping ahead for good reason. The life of the Prophet. I really want to talk about, this lecture is more about the rise of Islam. In other words, how did Islam become a civilization, a polity? What are the steps? And you can see, so this is the trajectory of the conquests first from Medina, and then eventually from Damascus. So that, huge areas of land, first by the Arab expansions, the first years, and then after 660, when the first genealogical dynasty, the Umayyad dynasty, started ruling from Damascus. And it took, basically the entire Sasanian Empire, which had been around for, 6 centuries if you count just the immediately prior ruler, or if you go back to the Persian, the old Persian Empire is over, well over a millennia. Similarly, with a big chunk of the Byzantine Empire, not the whole thing. So that was a active and continuously hot border between the Islamic Caliphate and the Byzantine Empire. But nevertheless, a large chunk of Byzantium also fell very quickly. And this is one of the mysteries of world history. And the standard answer is that, again, that the Byzantines and Sasanians were fighting so much that their regimes were weakened, and that this new resurgent Arab tribe, basically super tribe, had all the energy going for it, and the people in these places were welcoming this new conqueror because they saw that this was the future. And so I wanted to show you this slide. Basically, what interests me about it is primarily the color. What we have here is mostly brown, right? Not a lot of green. And remember, we talked about one of the main necessary ingredients for civilization is agriculture. So there's good reason why civilization was not. Arabia again was a trading center. There was some light agriculture, but there wasn't a type of agriculture that's necessary to build to have a major civilization like you have in Byzantine and Sasanian empires. Again, just to give you a vivid image to help you remember the importance of the camel in transporting goods across Arabia for the merchants. So in terms of the pre-Islamic Arabian economy, the three major aspects are again, raising livestock and semi-nomadism, going from watering hole to watering hole, looking for where the rain had last come to feed the crop, to feed the flocks. Some small agriculture, particularly date palms and a few other products, transporting goods from one empire to another, and also raiding. In other words, going into on the edge of the cities and taking things. And this was again possible because if you could get out of the city with the stuff, it was very difficult for these imperial armies to chase you into the desert. So again, we're talking about when we say arid desert, it's not completely bone dry. Some watering holes, some green, just not a lot. So you have to know what you're doing, know where you are. Again, date palms, one of the major crops, and this comes up again in the life of the Prophet often. That Medina specifically had a lot of orchards, date orchards. And again, to help you remember, picture some livestock here. So again, finding a place to water the flocks and to feed them was a central activity of these tribal communities. So let's think about, if in civilizations we talked about the social order as being complex, hierarchical division of labor, urban and rural. The social order in a tribal society like that of pre-Islamic Arabia is much more flat. What you had were tribes, which are extensive, fictive, genealogical communities that effectively constitute a political unit in the society. So it's both the social order and the political order here. And tribes are subdivided into clans, which are subdivided further into subclans and families. So in lieu of estates, you had an intricate tribal network, in which the legitimacy is, the legitimacy for warfare is marked by one's tribal allegiance and tied to a territory usually. Again, the laws known the law of blood. So in other words, there's a understanding that if blood is shed between one tribesman and another tribesman, that there's going to be a ransom. There's going to be a payment that is due the other tribe. But again, when we say flat social order, we mean there's no one leader. Each tribe has a council, and no tribe is dominant over the other tribes. Here we have before the coming of the Prophet, we have a description of the different tribes that were dominant in the different regions. So you can see, if you find your way to Mecca and Medina, you can see the Quraysh just next to the red, right in the middle basically, and it's Mecca, Makkah spelled here, is delineated there, and so I'm going to talk more about the Quraysh and their extremely important role in pre-Islamic Arabia in the next lecture. But the main point of this slide, I don't need you obviously to learn the names of all these tribes. What I want you to understand is that the political order is dominated in pre-Islamic Arabia by tribes, and these tribes are tied to different regions in Arabia. So what is the nature of of religion and values in this context in pre-Islamic Arabia? I'm going to just mention two. One is helm, which is usually defined as patience or the virtue of forbearance. In other words, being strong in face of difficulty. And maruwa is a similar is opposite. In other words, it's connected, and it's really kind of uh, being a man in the old-fashioned sense of being tough when things are difficult, keeping a cool head, and not blowing your stack. So on the one hand, these are some of the values that are extolled, and you can see this is partly due to the fact that it's an extremely difficult environment to survive. So you need patience, forbearance. These are the virtues. And then in terms of the religion proper, it's a polytheistic society. In other words, each tribe and sometimes each clan will have its own gods and goddesses associated with it, and there were idols associated with these gods and goddesses. This is more common than monotheism in most times and places in human history. Just to sort of orient you a bit, the idea of one god rather than many is in the history of humanity relatively new, and again, it does come with the rise of civilization, and it takes a while even to get that. It's not so obvious that this is the model that was going to win out, and it's certainly not universal even today. So it's not. We shouldn't think of of this tribal polytheistic society as the odd one in this story. It's actually fairly standard. And I should mention, in addition to the numerous gods, there was one god that was considered the transcendent god over the gods and goddesses. And it was this god had an extremely important function in that when tribes would make a pact with one another, they would take an oath over this high god. And because you could see the problem, in other words, if I have my god and you have your god, and we have to make a pact over which god is going to back up the pact. So this was the role of the high god, who was known as Allah, the god. So the concept of the god, the main god, existed in pre-Islamic Arabia as an indigenous. Well, we don't really know, but let's just say it's not coming from one of the prior monotheist faiths. It's local to Arabia. Yes, in addition to the Arabian religions, you did have Christianization and as well as Jewish tribes. In other words, there was some immigration to Arabia and Christianization of Arab tribes from Arabia. So the onset of some sort of process of this sort of new wave of monotheism that had been sweeping late antiquity did have some onset into Arabia, and doubtlessly it was partly from interactions between the traders and the populations in Arabia and among the Arabs in Byzantium. You also had, and this is quite interesting, a number of what I call unaffiliated monotheists who vision themselves as followers of Abraham, so Abrahamic, but did not call themselves either Jews or Christians. And what's interesting about this is it's actually referred to in the we have references to this in the biography of the Prophet, and I should say in this lecture I'm only giving material which is evidenced outside of the Islamic tradition. So we have evidence of this outside the Islamic tradition in Greek and Roman epigraphy, in writings. So there were sort of traces of monotheism in the Arabian Peninsula, in addition to polytheism. Another aspect of pre-Islamic religion concerns the role of poetry and the poets, a particular type of poet known as a kahin. And these were figures who were known to be enchanted by sprites, that is, jinn, these were non-material beings who were good at poetry and helped the Kahan compose it. The poetry could be used to praise your own tribe and to satire and criticize the opposing tribe. And this was helpful in warfare and also helpful to stigmatize one of your enemies. So it's another aspect of pre-Islamic Arabia that would find another place in the um, Arabic Islamic tradition. And it was also important during the life of the Prophet. It comes out in several ways. For example, one of the charges of Muhammad was that he was just a kahan. In other words, and the Quran was poetry. But this was easily rebutted by the fact, classically, with the notion of the Quran's inimitability. That is, the inability for humans to create it because of its perfection. We'll be talking about that when we discuss the Quran. When I talk about the life of the Prophet in the next lecture, I'm going to be talking about the importance of trade in the history of the Prophet, according to the medieval Muslim historians. But I'll just mention here specifically. So this is, I'm transitioning a bit from pre-Islamic Arabia generally to specifically the time just before the Prophet came on the scene. We have the ascent of a particular tribe, the Quraysh tribe, economically, financially. So they, through a series of trade agreements called the Elaf agreements, they had made legal contracts with a number of the tribes between Mecca, which they controlled, and Byzantium, thus giving them a kind of advantage and stacking the deck in their favor economically, to use rhetoric that is now in common parlance. And so they had grown pretty wealthy, and this sets the scene for the life of the Prophet and the criticisms in the Quran. Criticisms classically, again, by God in the Quran of the Quraysh and how they were behaving inhumanely and unethically. So I'm going to actually skip over the life of the Prophet in this lecture and discussion of the first rightly guided caliphs, the Prophet's successors, simply because in this lecture I'm concentrating on what critical historians can all agree on in terms of the history. The life of the Prophet is actually, and the coming together of the Quran and the status of the first caliphs is a point of contestation, of disagreement among scholars. In other words, exactly how much we can know about this period of the life of the Prophet per se in the Quran and the first rightly guided caliphs is there's a disagreement about. And to just anticipate what I'll talk about in the next lecture, essentially we all agree, all historians agree, that there was someone named Muhammad, that he had a community in Medina and that overtook Mecca between the years 610 and 635. I mean, the classical death date is 630. Some people say 632. My colleague Stephen Shoemaker has argued for a little bit of a later date. But in any case, all of that there's a consensus about. There's also a consensus that much of the Quran was composed and collected in the very early period. There's disagreement, though, about almost everything else. So there are a number of scholars who are skeptical of the capacity of the early Muslim historians writing a century later to record what actually happened. And there's those who think that, so there are those who throw out the whole story and and offer counter stories. There are those who think that basically the traditional story is correct, in other words, can be trusted. And you just leave out the supernatural bits, and the rest of it is plausible. And there are those in between who think probably some of it is authentic and some of it is fabricated, and the object is to figure out which is which. And so too, the status of the early caliphs somewhat debated. So I'll get to that next time. So if we skip the life of the Prophet and the early caliphs, we get to the Umayyads. This is the first genealogical dynasty of Islam, and they are actually the Quraysh who ruled Mecca prior to the coming of the Prophet. So that same tribe that got wealthy ended up being their offspring a generation later were the ones who essentially ended up taking over the world. It's really they who took the Umayyad and took the Byzantine and Sasanian empires down um, under the under the in the form of being Muslims at this point, but Umayyad Muslims. So among the aspects of the development of Islam during the Umayyad period is the Arabization of the entire region. So whereas before Arabic was a language limited to these tribes in Arabia, it became the administrative language for the entire Muslim world. So the Diwan, the registry, all of the administrative records were recorded in Arabic, and so the Arabic script was developed and standardized, whereas before it was not very well developed. It became increasingly well developed, and the letters became more and more disambiguated with dots, and I'll get to that when we discuss the Quran in a couple of minutes. So this is all under the Umayyads. Garrison towns were established outside the population centers in Byzantium and the Sasanian, and so that was the model. The Muslims came into a region, set up a town for the tribesmen outside of the population centers, and administered from there. But eventually, inevitably, there came to be increasingly blurring between the garrison towns and the population, and people became, and more converts joined the folds. But conversion was not, and this is one of the, common images that people have of the rise of Islam. Conversion was not necessarily encouraged, and this is for the simple reason that the taxes were higher on non-Muslims. So really, these tribesmen were collecting a lot of taxes from these non-Muslims, and so there wasn't. On the one way, you could say there's an economic incentive to converting. The other way is there wouldn't be a lot of pressure to convert because the wealth was coming in as a result of them not being Muslim. Moreover, when you did convert, you converted as what was known as a mawla in the Umayyad period. Mawla is usually translated as a client, so one had to affiliate with a tribe. And you were a Muslim, a mawla Muslim, a client Muslim to an Arab tribe. You had to be sponsored. So this was only during the Umayyad period, to be clear. It was eradicated after that. But essentially what that really meant was that in this period you had classes of Muslims, Arab Muslims and non-Arab Muslims who were mawla. This is to say that the Muslims in this early period, essentially the first century of Islam, essentially served as overlords to population centers that were mainly Jewish and Christian. So they were a very small minority, the Muslims, in this period. There wasn't a lot of encouragement to convert, and Islam was primarily for the Arabs, with some non-Arabs joining voluntarily. So what was established in this period in the way of Islam? Well, first of all, public worship, the Friday prayer, and the idea of a Jama' mosque, that is a Friday congregational mosque, the khutbah, the sermon after the prayer service, and the fact that the minbar, the platform upon which the person gives the imam or the other person giving the khutbah stands, all of this was part of was established in the Umayyad period. So that is from the very early times, the basic public worship had been established, as were the 5 pillars, which are mentioned in the Quran, but they were identified as pillars very early in the Umayyad period. There are, as I think a lot of you know from your high school courses or elsewhere, the testimony of faith that there is one God, and that Muhammad is the prophet, daily prayer, fasting during the month of Ramadan, the giving of alms, and the making Hajj if possible at least once during your lifetime during the month of Hajj. So all of this established during the Umayyad period. The Umayyads appointed judges, that is, those who were enjoined or charged with doling out certain aspects of the law and sanctioned by the state to do so. So this again during the Umayyad period, first established and continued on. All of these things continued on, obviously. Well, except this next one on the list. The Umayyad caliphs were seen as during the Umayyad period as a divinely guided model that one should imitate. That is to say that the sunnah is an extremely important word we're going to be using again and again. So that's a key word that you really need to know. Sunna, sunnah. It essentially means a good model, a good model. So according to medieval Muslim, the ulama, the medieval Muslim scholars and Muslims generally, sunnah now, and I should add Muslims today, sunnah refers to the model of the Prophet Muhammad. However, in the Umayyad period, it could refer to, and primarily did refer to, the model of the caliphs. So the Umayyads viewed themselves as divinely guided, and their followers took them as such. The medieval Muslim scholars later on, of course, completely revised this, and it's hard to know how many people took it seriously, or if these Umayyad caliphs were just trying to use this as a source of their own legitimacy. But in any case, there's good evidence that there was such a thing as Umayyad Sunnah. And finally, coinage reform. The Umayyads reformed the faces of the coins. And of course, this is particularly interesting just because it's so accessible. We have a full run of Umayyad coins from the beginning until the end of the Umayyad rule. And a lot of these are in the, they're all over the place, but among the places where they are is the American Numismatic Society, numismatic meaning the study of coins. And so it's possible to take a look at these in New York, where you can just go. It's a public access. They've also put a lot of them online. So I'm going to show you a few. I'm not going to say a lot about them now. I'm going to wait because I want you to look at them yourself and decide what you think what these images are. I'm just taking a guess. So I'm going to show you some of them right now. So here's the first image. So what does that look like to you? What do you see there? Just take a minute and take a note. What could that be? Again, another Umayyad period coin. What is going on? What are these images? So this is obviously the front and back and the two images. So you could hit pause on your video and take a look and take a note of what's going on these images. Again, a third image, a little bit different here. So see what you can identify there. And here's an image from a few years later. We're starting to get the development. You can see I'll just tell you what kind of writing is there on the right. That's Arabic. I'll just tell you around the outside of the margin. So now all of a sudden you have Arabic. And what are these three guys on the left doing, do you think? It's fascinating. So you're looking at a coin that was minted prior to 700, I believe. It's around 704, I think this one's year is. Another one here, again, Arabic now on the left and the right on both sides of the coin. What's this guy have in his, what's he doing and who is he, do you think? And what's this on this other side? This thing that looks like it could be, well, I don't want to presuppose your thoughts on it, but yeah, take a note and see what you think of it. And this might be something you can discuss online in your discussion. It'll be one of your options for the discussion question for today. And on this last one, this is obviously quite a dramatic shift. And this is the result of Abdul Malik, the Umayyad caliph's coinage reform. Abdul Malik came into power, and Umayyad caliph came into power in 705. Here you have obviously full only Arabic literatures, no icons. Um, and what do you think would he'd put on the coins? I mean, what do you think the writing says? Obviously, this is discussed in the Shepherd, but if you haven't seen the Shepherd, or if you've forgotten, just take think to yourself, what would you put on a coin if you're a Muslim ruler? So I'll be asking about this as one of your discussion questions. What you think was, what you could say about the development of coins. What are some of the images? So following the Umayyads, we have the Abbasid caliphs after the year 750. And here we have a second phase of Islamization. So first of all, we have the centrality of the Prophet's Sunnah. The idea of caliphal Sunnah is no longer around. That is after the Abbasid revolts, that goes, and the status of the caliphs are diminished. They're no longer seen as divinely guided figures. It's the Prophet alone who's divinely guided. So the role of the caliph becomes a successor to the Prophet. That's what caliph comes to mean. Originally, it meant a deputy of God, Khalifat Allah. After the Abbasid period, it came to mean Khalifat Rasulullah, the successor to the Prophet of God. So a great diminishment in the status, and in religious terms at least. Concomitantly, at the same time, there's a raise in the status of the scholars, the ulama, because it's they who are the ones charged with interpreting what the Sunnah, or establishing what the Sunnah of the Prophet is. So it's in the Abbasid period that the ulama really become charged with formulating what the religion is, that is to say, how to best believe and practice the religion of God. In terms of the caliphate, there's a move from Damascus to Baghdad mostly, and also Samarkand for a brief period. So that is to say, a move east with models of rule associated with this that coming from the east. That is the older Sasanian models for the caliph, and finally you have a kind of collaboration, a kind of a peace between the caliph and the scholars. So the caliph starts to patronize scholars more, and they're independent, but they do collaborate with the caliphs and with his administration. What I'd like to speak about next is the development of the Arabic script in general, but specifically toward the Quran, Quranic orthography. That is the way the Quran is set down in writing. And I want you to think about this as a kind of, it's interesting in its own terms, but I also want to think about this as a scholarly problem and share with you the problem and allow you in your discussion groups to kind of see what you think and weigh in on it. So let's look at this. This is an extremely early fragment sheet on not papyrus. This one is on vellum, that is animal skin. A very early Quranic writing, almost certainly Umayyad period. So most of you don't know Arabic. I think a couple of you do. But even those who do will have you'll be able to identify words, I expect, but have a hard time reading this. So even for people who are very comfortable in Arabic, it's difficult to read because first of all, the ligatures, that is the letters, are quite different in their form. But also, there are no dots. Arabic classically, that is to say after the 9th century, had a full slate of dots and markings to disambiguate several letters which otherwise have the same shape. So it would almost like trying to read something. It's hard to give an analogy with English. But let's just say really the only way to read something like this is if you kind of know what the words are ahead of time. So basically if someone read to you what the verse was and you already had heard it, and then you see this, it's a reminder of what you've already been told. There's another sample of this very early
probably Umayyad or perhaps very early Abbasid period script. So we're talking about probably, I mean, certainly no later than 770, but probably earlier. Again, no dots. Here we start to have some developments, right? So even though, without even knowing Arabic, what's the difference here? Immediately you see red dots, there's a green dot, you've got some gold leaf, and you have in this gold leaf, what's going on partly is you have the name of a verse, verse separator first of all, and also the name of a chapter. So you start to get chapter names in these slightly later set of fragments that weren't in the earlier set, and also the ligatures are starting to get more developed with the use of these dots. Again, here we have another sample of the dots, but this time there's even more, and you have the red dots, but you also have some other kinds of, you can see that little squiggle on the second line about halfway through. You have this is a vowel, well, it's a consonant repetition. So you start to have more developments in the history of Arabic ligature, so slightly later ligatures as they're, the development. So here, this is obviously much more mature. There was a figure named Ibn Muqbal who developed a very specific formula for writing Quranic ligatures for the way you write Quran. So there really becomes almost like a craft of Quran, of writing the Quran, and they standardized the letters and made it much more readable and accessible. And you can see the dots are fully available now, and these really allow you to disambiguate, for example, if it's a s or a sh or a t or a th. All of the letters become distinct and easily readable, fully legible. You also have here, you don't actually in this, actually no, we got some short vowels, but they're not complete. You do have full verse separators, those medallions, verse separators. So just a lot more information being conveyed on this image. So in this image, beyond the fact that you start to get this ornamentation, which is quite beautiful, but here you have all these dot lines, these little lines and dots. This is full vocal, what's known as full vocalization. In other words, all the short vowels are now present. Arabic, the consonants don't include, the consonants are marked, but the vowels are not in Arabic script, including today. So if you read the newspaper, there's no short vowels marked. You just are expected to know what they are from just knowing the word. But they did develop short vowel markings, and for the Quran, because it's so important to pronounce everything correctly, to again disambiguate, to clarify exactly what the text is. In any Quran you're going to find, it's going to have today all of the short vowels will be marked, and here you have them fully developed. Again, this is Ibn Muqbal who first did this, but here's a sample of it. Again, another sample of a different style, but with all the short vowels marked here. Different style of writing. So there came to be different styles of writing in different regions of Quranic orthography, that is, in different periods and all different regions. And this one I believe is actually, I'm not sure the provenance, I'm not sure the place this one was copied, but I just gave you another sample there. And this one you can see is quite beautiful with the garden around the images, around the words. So here we have yet another development. Here we have, this is a type of a commentary where you have the name of the chapter up there in gold leaf, the beginning of the chapter. And in addition to everything we've talked about before, in the red, in rubrication, you have a translation between the lines. This is a translation, I believe, in Urdu. So, it's a translation in the end is another type of interpretation, just like the vowel markings, like it's giving even more information here for non-Arabic speakers. So all of these developments in the Quran raise a question that I want to get to in your discussion group, which I'll give you now. So the discussion questions I want to present you with are these. Um, so first of all, what do the images that the early Umayyads put on their coins in the first years of minting intend to signal? So so the question is really to look over these images on the coins and what are some of these images, do you think? And what were they intended to signal? And then, of course, in the final image with the Arabic writing, what, what does this what does this indicate? So I'm going to develop this a bit more, unpack it a bit for you in the actual discussion question. But I want you to look back at these images of the coins, and I'll put copies of the coins on the discussion section as well if I can. And if I can't, I guess I'll just give you the PowerPoint without the sound so you can look at them. So that's question one. The second one is this problem I refer to with early Quran. And the problem is this. We have, for example, a lot of fragments now being discovered, or a number of fragments anyway, that are very, very early, and they don't have any vowel markings, as I showed you. So this raises the question, should scholars presume that the Quran was read the same way and read the vowel markings in the later Muslim scholars put in for us to read? So, for example, say you have a fragment that was that because of carbon dating and other ways of establishing a provenance and date, we know was, for example, discovered in the year 700 in Yemen or 690 in Yemen. Now we don't have any Qurans with vowels because vowels haven't been invented yet. And because of the lack of vowels, there's different ways of reading these words. Vowels were only put in there around 800. So should we assume when you're, for example, you're doing an edition, you're making a publication of these things, should you put the vowels in or should you leave them blank? In other words, how much confidence should we have in the early generations of Muslims to have recorded that revelation accurately, orally, and kept it alive so that when the first Muslims who wrote with vowels started writing them in, they recorded them accurately? And in some sense, okay, this sounds like a small issue, but in fact, it relates to really the whole historiographic question of how much we can know about early Islam and how much we can trust later generations of Muslims to accurately present the memories from a century before. And I think this is something we'll be talking about in different ways for this entire week, is thinking about Muslim memory and its capacity and how much of it is devoted to keeping an accurate view, and how much of it is devoted to saying things that are important for the contemporary community, and not so worried about accuracy, but more worried about saying something that's meaningful and relevant for the time they were in the time that they were living. So we'll be talking about this again. So that's it for this lecture, and I'm going to be adding your discussion questions into the discussion groups. And I think for this, I'm going to ask you, you of course can write on both of them, but if you write on both of them, the second one is just extra credit. I'm really just asking you to write on one of them. And I'd also like you this week to, and I'll be again reminding you of this, but in addition to writing an independent comment, do look over your colleagues' comments if they're colleagues who preceded you, and try to make a transition from what somebody else said and into what you're saying, to try to have a back and forth. And for those who wrote the initial comment, you can go ahead and write again. In other words, I'd like to get a little bit of almost like a conversation rather than just a series of statements.